It begins, as so many southern nightmares do, in silence. Not the silence of peace, but of something held back, smothered, forced beneath the surface of the Louisiana swamps. The bayou is vast, its waters dark and slow-moving, carrying secrets, like corpses drifting just beneath the surface. And somewhere in those waters, generations ago, a family withdrew from the world. They did not disappear by accident. They turned their backs on the church bells, on the town square, on the neighbors, who looked at them with suspicion. They retreated into the murk, into cabins that seemed to sink into the soil itself, where daylight was swallowed by moss, and the air never smelled of anything but rot and damp wood. That family bore a name whispered but never spoken aloud after. Nightfall, Broussard. At first there was nothing monstrous in them. They were settlers, poor and proud, eking out a living where land was cheap and neighbors scarce. But isolation is a breeding ground for shadow, and in their solitude the Broussards began to look inward rather than outward. Marriage to outsiders became rare. Marriage to kin became frequent. Cousin to cousin, brother to sister, aunt to nephew. Each union bound tighter the strands of blood until their children carried not the strength of two lines, but the weakness of one folded endlessly back upon itself. Faces began to look too similar, voices slurred, bodies stooped, and still they bred among themselves, as if each birth were both a curse and a sentence pronounced upon the future by the mid-19th century. The Broussards were already spoken of as not right. Travelers passing along the bayou road told of figures glimpsed at dusk, pale, slack-jawed children peering from behind warped shutters, their eyes too large for their faces, their limbs thin as branches. In town, a minister's wife whispered that she had seen a Broussard woman with a child who never stopped drooling, whose head lolled as though his neck were broken. Others claimed they saw no women at all, only men, gaunt and hollow-eyed, moving silently between the trees like wraiths. The line between rumor and truth began to dissolve, but the darkest whispers came not of deformity, but of hunger. In years, when crops failed, when the waters swallowed fields, and the swamp turned stingy, the Broussards were said to vanish deeper still into their rotting cabins. Smoke rose from their chimneys, but no game was ever seen carried in. Neighbors, who brought them sacks of corn or flour, found doors barred, voices hissing behind wood. And then, when spring returned, when food was again plentiful, a new grave might appear in the orchard, small, shallow, with no marker. Some said those graves held the sick. Others said they held the eaten. What do men do when hunger becomes unbearable? When one's children cry through the night, and no hunt returns with meat? The Broussards knew, or so the stories claimed. A child who lingered too long at the swamp's edge might never return. A drifter, last seen heading down the mud track toward their homestead, might never again be mentioned in polite company. To speak of it aloud was to risk inviting the curse into your own home. But still the rumors grew. The Broussards fed on themselves. They ate their own dead, and when death did not come swiftly enough, they hastened it. Inside their cabins, it is said, the air was thick with the stink of smoke and tallow. Fat rendered down not from beasts, but from something closer to human. Bones stacked, not discarded, but kept. Skulls used as crude bowls, as if the line between necessity and ritual had long since dissolved. Whether these were the inventions of fearful neighbors, or the terrible truth is lost now. But the legend has teeth that still bite. What is certain is that the Broussards were not like other families. They lived apart, they married only themselves, and their children carried the evidence of both practices, written plainly in their bodies. The church, fearful of what it saw, stopped sending missionaries to their doors. No priest blessed their marriages. No bell tolled for their dead. They were outside the circle of faith, abandoned even by God in the eyes of their neighbors, and so they fell deeper into themselves, bound by secrecy, by shame, by the knowing hunger that never left their eyes. A traveler, in the late 1800s described stumbling upon a Broussard cabin after nightfall. He said the door opened only a crack, and behind it he saw sisters 3, 4, perhaps more, all peering out, all disturbingly alike. The eldest among them spoke in a tongue he could not understand, his words slurred and guttural, as if his mouth were not made for speech. Behind him, he swore he saw something worse, a long table, crude and splintered, its surface scarred with deep cuts and stains that looked black even in dim lamplight. He fled without waiting to learn more. By morning, he was gone from the parish, leaving only his story behind. The Broussards became less a family than a legend. To frighten children, parents would hiss, "Stay close, or the Broussards will take you." Hunters swore they heard voices chanting in the swamp at night, low and droning, punctuated by sounds that were not human. A boy claimed to have seen bones hanging from trees like charms, picked clean and white by the sun. And though no sheriff or preacher ever confirmed such stories, no one sought too hard to disprove them either. Some shadows are safer left unexplored, for, in the swamp, in the stifling darkness where the air itself seems thick with decay, the Broussards endured. They buried their secrets in shallow graves, in locked rooms, in the silence that presses harder than chains. They raised their children to carry forward not just their blood, but their hunger, and in doing so, they created something more than a family. They created a warning. And so the legend begins, not with proof, but with whispers, carried like mist over stagnant water. The Broussards, a name that curdled the tongue, a family bound to one another in blood, in taboo. And so, the story goes, in the flesh of the very bodies they consumed. As the 19th century slipped into the 20th, the Broussards were less a family than a shadow cast over the bayou. People did not see them so much as feel their presence, sane unease in the trees, a watchful silence on nights when the fog rolled thick across the water. Their cabins, half hidden behind curtains of Spanish moss, stood like mausoleums for the living, doors bolted shut from the inside, windows boarded, nailed with such force the wood splintered. No one entered, no one left, and still, smoke rose, always smoke. The rumors of cannibalism hardened into a certainty that no neighbor dared challenge. A girl went missing on the road between Abbeville and the swamp. A trapper never returned from his rounds. When search parties crept close to the Broussard land, dogs howled and pulled back, their hackles raised, refusing to advance. Men swore they saw shadows moving inside the cabins, figures huddled together, faces grotesquely similarized to wide, jaws misshapen, bodies hunched. But no voice welcomed them. No cry for help emerged. Only the faint sound of something dripping, slow and steady, like blood falling into a basin. Inside those cabins, Insid one believes the stories, the rituals had become unholy. Hunger was no longer just necessity. It was inheritance, sharpened by decades of marrying only themselves. Children were raised not to flinch at the sight of blood, not to weep at the sight of a body lowered to the floor. They were taught that flesh was flesh, and survival required devotion to family above all else. And so the line blurred between animal and man, between brother and prey, between kin and meat. By this time, even the parish officials no longer wrote the Broussards' names in the census. It was as if the family had been erased, excised from the ledger of the living. But erasure does not silence memory. Whispers carried through the years, handed down like a curse. A deputy once told of riding past their land on horseback and hearing a sound he could not describe, not laughter, not weeping, but something between the two, high-pitched, cracked, as if children were trying to speak through throats too damaged to form words. He swore he saw bones arranged in a circle near their cabin, as though they worshipped not God, but the emptiness that devoured them. It is said that sometimes, on nights of flood and famine, the Broussards would emerge from their caverns. They came barefoot, moving silently through the cypress, their bodies gaunt, their eyes shining white in the moonlight. They hunted not with guns but with knives, rusty and jagged, blades made from farm tools. They did not kill swiftly. Victims were taken into the swamp, their cries muffled, their ends unseen. By dawn, only silence remained, and yet the evidence lingered, bootprints leading nowhere, patches of ground churned by struggle, and sometimes the faintest scrap of clothing snagged on a branch. Generations passed like this, each one more insular, more twisted, more bound to the legend. The children born were frail, their minds clouded, their speech broken. Yet they obeyed the family's law. Marry no outsider, reveal nothing, protect the bloodline at any cost, even if that cost was unspeakable. Especially then. And then, suddenly, it ended, or seemed to. Sometime in the early 20th century, the Broussard cabins were found abandoned. The windows that had once been boarded now hung open, yawning like empty mouths. Inside, the air was still heavy with rot, though no fresh smoke curled from the chimneys. On the walls, crude carvings were found, circles, crosses twisted backward, symbols no one could read. On the floors lay stains so deep they had soaked into the wood itself. And in one corner, beneath a broken chair, a pile of bones, small, fragile, unmistakably human. Who discovered this? The stories vary. Some say a sheriff's deputy stumbled upon it by accident, following a runaway cow. Others claim it was local boys hunting for treasure, lured by the legend of hidden riches. But whoever they were, they did not linger. They left quickly, pale and shaken, unwilling to describe too much of what they had seen. And so the cabins stood, rotting, until the swamp reclaimed them. Today, no trace remains. The trees have swallowed the clearings, and water lies where hearths once burned. But the legend refuses to die. Old men in the parish still mutter of the Broussards when the night grows long and the fire burns low. They say their bloodline scattered, that not all were lost. Some left the swamp, carrying with them the curse of inbreeding and the hunger that could never be named. They blended into towns, their deformities hidden, their voices softened, their past buried. Perhaps they live still among us, their names changed, their history erased, and if so, the Broussard bloodline endures quiet, watchful, waiting. Others insist the Broussards never left at all, that on fog-heavy nights, when the bayou is silent and the frogs cease their singing, you can still hear the faint scraping of knives against wood, the muffled sobs of the taken, the low guttural chanting that no living throat should ever produce. They say that deep in the swamp, beneath roots twisted like claws, there are still graves, and if you dig, if you dare, you will find bones gnawed clean, their marrow long since sucked dry. In the end, what is truth and what is myth scarcely matters. The Broussards have become something larger than flesh and bone. They are the embodiment of fear itself, the fear of hunger so great it devours morality, the fear of bloodlines twisted by secrecy and isolation, the fear of what we might become when the world turns its back and leaves us alone in the dark. And so their cabins are gone, their names erased, their graves unmarked, but the swamp remembers. The land holds memory, the way water holds reflection, fleeting but undeniable. Step into the Louisiana fog and listen. Somewhere, just beyond sight, a whisper moves between the trees, a whisper that carries a single name. Rotting but unforgotten, Broussard. The Broussards may be gone, their cabins swallowed by the swamp, their faces blurred into legend. But the silence they left behind still presses heavy on the bayou air. A silence born of hunger, of secrecy, of bloodlines tangled too tightly to escape. Perhaps they were victims of isolation. Perhaps they were monsters forged by their own choices. Perhaps both truths live side by side in the shadows. And if we listen closely, if we dare, we may hear more stories like theirs. Families erased from memory, lives twisted into myth, truths so grotesque that entire towns conspired to bury them. If this story has unsettled you, if it has drawn you into the fog of forgotten America, then stay with us, because there are more legends waiting in the dark, more names that history refused to speak aloud. Subscribe now. Step deeper into the shadows, and let the past whisper its secrets to you once more.